Let me, Mr.
Ich
Gabriel.
möchte natürlich auch die Zuschauer
Well, I would like
herzlich
to
willkommen
welcome
heißen, die uns hier
you all, and welcome
gleichzeitig
the
via
audience also who
Livestream verfolgen und
are following this
zugeschaltet
on the
sind.
internet.
Und mich noch kurz
And I
vorzustellen,
just
mein
want to
Name ist
briefly
Astrid
introduce
Frohloff,
myself.
ich bin
I'm Astrid
Fernsehjournalistin
Frohloff.
und
I'm a
Moderatorin
TV
und habe das
journalist
Vergnügen,
and
Sie heute
moderator,
durch den
and
Abend zu
I have the pleasure
begleiten.
of accompanying you through this evening.
Das Unternehmen Google, meine
Well,
Damen
Google
und Herren, ist einer der
is
größten,
one of the
innovativsten,
largest and
aber auch
most
meist
innovative
kritisiertesten
but most
Global
criticized
Player in der
global players
digitalen
in the
Welt.
digital
Gerade hier in
world.
Deutschland werden ja die
Particularly
Aktivitäten
here in
von
Germany,
Google mit
people
größter Besorgnis verfolgt.
follow
Und auch
Google's
der
activities with
Bundeswirtschaftsminister
great concern,
hat ja
and
mit
the
seiner Kritik an dem
Economic Affairs
Unternehmen
Minister
nicht
has
hinterm Berg
also
gehalten.
openly criticized the
Dass er
company.
nun heute zum
fact that
Auftakt der
we now have
Veranstaltung den Google-Chef höchstpersönlich zu
head of
Gast
Google
hat
himself
hier, das
this
verspricht,
event.
glaube ich, einen
I think
spannungsreichen
that does
Abend.
promise
Wir freuen
us
uns,
a very
bitte begrüßen
exciting
Sie sehr
evening,
herzlich
and
mit mir Ihren
it's
heutigen
lovely to be able
Gastgeber,
to
den
welcome
Minister
you,
für Wirtschaft und Energie,
Mr.
Sigmar
Schmidt, together
Gabriel.
with Sigmar Gabriel, our host this evening.
And from the United States, we're also very happy to welcome the Executive Chairman of Google, Eric Schmidt. It's a great pleasure to have you here. Big Data, meine Damen und Herren, also
big data,
massenhaft gesammelte Kundendaten.
the mass collection of customer data, that's the raw materials which Internet products use to develop new products and services. We consumers, we have fascinating opportunities as a result of that, on the one hand. At the same time, these new technologies do create new challenges and big dangers. Challenges and dangers we didn't know about a few years ago. So this is the interface we're working on this evening. This is where we want to discuss. We want to talk about the value of our data, about freedom, about innovation and data sovereignty in the digital world. And you're all very much invited to participate. You can pose your questions during the panel discussions. You can do it via the microphones, but you can also do it through the social media. You can do it via Facebook, Google+, or Twitter. Hashtag Wirtschaft für morgen, one word. But now, your host, Minister Gabriel.
Sehr geehrte Frau Frohloff, meine sehr geehrten Damen und
Frau
Herren, lieber Eric Schmidt.
Ladies and gentlemen, Eric Schmidt.
Herzlich willkommen.
Welcome to what is a premiere here. This is a premiere in our series of dialogues called Commerce for Tomorrow, which we're holding here in the Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Energy. Now, we want to use this series of events to talk with top brains from all around the world and talk about how to shape a successful and modern business world for tomorrow, which serves society and improves everybody's lives. We want to discuss openly and, if necessary, contentiously in the panel, but of course also with the audience here in this hall and also online, because I believe contentious debate really is a driving force for fresh ideas. Now, we couldn't have chosen a more prominent guest for the beginning of this series than the chairman of one of the most unusual and most successful, and with an estimated value of $160 billion, one of the most valuable companies in the world. I'm very glad, I'm delighted that we have Eric Schmidt here to participate in our debate. Eric Schmidt, welcome to Berlin, welcome to the Federal Ministry of Economic Affairs and Energy.
Google,
well, ladies and gentlemen, nobody is left cold by the thought of Google. Almost everybody uses it. A market share of more than 90% of Germany. Many people admire it, and many people are a bit skeptical, or maybe even some of them fear it. Google embodies, like virtually no other company, the digital revolution. Eric Schmidt and I met back in April, and I can tell you, we sort of sniffed each other out a bit, and as you would expect, we didn't agree on everything, but I would like to mention two things which I did really remember from this first meeting. Firstly, nobody can doubt the potential of technological innovations and the major opportunities
und kulturelle Fortschritte in
for
unserer Gesellschaft.
social and cultural progress in our
Niemand kann
societies.
Zweifel daran
Nobody
haben,
can
dass
doubt
die digitalisierten
that the
Dienste und
digitized
Produkte
services and products
für jeden Einzelnen von uns große Vorteile mit sich
can
bringen können.
bring great advantages for everybody, and already do so. They make our life easier, they make it quicker,
Gesünder,
they
sicherer
make it
oder
healthier,
schlauer machen,
safer, or even
können
wiser,
jedenfalls und die uns teilhaben lassen an
and
der
they
Welt,
help us to participate in the
an der
world,
Kreativität, der
in the
Fantasie und den
creativity,
Ideen
the
unglaublich vieler Menschen.
imagination of an
Auch
awful lot of
übrigens an
people,
ihren Wünschen, Sorgen,
and
Bedrohungen
also
und
in their wishes, their
Lebensumständen.
concerns,
Die Welt ist wirklich
their
eng
threats,
zueinander
the way they live.
gerückt und
Really, the world has
es
come
führt erstmal dazu,
closer together,
dass
and this
wir
means that for the
viel
first time
mehr miteinander zu tun
we have a
haben,
lot more to do with
als
each other
vielleicht noch die
than
Generation vor
maybe
uns.
the preceding
Das
generation
ist
did.
wirklich eine
That
Revolution,
truly is a
weil das
revolution,
alles eben auch ein Freiheitsversprechen beinhaltet,
because it involves a
das noch vor
promise of
20
liberty
Jahren kaum vorstellbar
which was virtually unimaginable
Der
20
zweite
years
Punkt,
ago.
der mir während
And the
unseres
second
letzten
point, which I
Gesprächs
really
besonders
noticed during our last
auffiel,
meeting,
war wirklich diese
was this
beneidenswerte Zuversicht,
amazing
dieser
optimism, this
unerschütterliche Optimismus von Erik Schmidt,
unbreakable
dass die Technologie
confidence
das Leben
of
der
Eric
Menschheit
Schmidt that,
natürlich
of course,
ausschließlich verbessern kann.
technology will make people's lives
Auch wenn ich
better.
glaube, dass die Weisheit der Alten leider immer noch ihre
No,
Gültigkeit
I
hat,
still
dass
believe the
nämlich die
older
Geschichte
people
immer
do have some
zwei
wisdom as
Verläufe
well.
haben kann, den zur Freiheit
But
und den in die genau gegengesetzte Richtung.
I believe it can go in the
Ich also
direction
nicht
of
glaube, dass
liberty,
der
but also in the
Optimismus von
opposite
Erik Schmidt sozusagen
direction. So I don't
bedingungslos
think we
und
should
nur
unconditionally share
Technologie
Eric Schmidt's optimism,
quasi von alleine kommt.
and that the technology and the
Sondern es eben am
advantages will
Ende
just come on
darauf
their own.
ankommt, wie
But
der
openly,
gesellschaftliche
at
und
the
der
end,
soziale
ultimately it depends on
wie
how
der politische
society
Zusammenhang ist, in dem
and the
die
political
Technologie
context
ihre
is
Wirkung
in which
entfalten kann.
the technology
So sage
unleashes
ich
its
doch,
impact.
Von diesem Spirit,
But I do say,
von diesem
nevertheless, that
Monopol auf Optimismus,
we
wie es
can
gerade jemand geschrieben
really
hat,
benefit from this
dieser
monopoly of
Grundhaltung
optimism,
von
from the
Eric
spirit,
Schmidt
from this basic
können wir uns in
attitude of
Deutschland
Eric Schmidt. We
durchaus
really
eine
can
Scheibe abschneiden.
benefit from it in Germany.
Wir können stolz
We
auf
can be
unsere
proud of
Leistungen sein, aber
our
wir sollten
achievements,
auch mutiger
but we should
werden
also be more
und mehr auf unsere
courageous
Stärken vertrauen und
and
die
trust more in
Herausforderungen,
our strengths.
die diese
And the
Revolution,
challenges
die Vernetzung
which this revolution,
der
this
Welt
networking of the
miteinander,
world,
der Gegenstände miteinander,
this networking of objects
die auch annehmen
has brought.
als etwas, was
We should
wir
grasp it
gestalten können.
as something we can
Angst
shape.
davon jedenfalls sollten wir nicht
We
haben.
certainly should not be afraid of it.
Von diesen Stärken haben wir in Deutschland
And we
also
have
einiges zu bieten.
quite a
Wenn
few
heute
strengths in
weltweit
Germany.
über Reindustrialisierung
When we're talking about
und
reindustrialization
Industrie 4.0, also
and
die Vernetzung
Industry 4.0,
industrieller
today,
Wertschöpfung,
there was
Dienstleistungsketten
a networking
geredet
of
wird,
internet
vor allem
and
Deutschland
production and services
dafür
chains, then
besonders
really
gut
it is
gerüstet ist.
Germany is very well
Und
equipped
anders
for
als
this.
andere haben
Because
wir rund
unlike
um das Jahr
other
2000
countries,
nicht auf die
we have
Ratschläge
not
gehört,
listened to the
wir mögen
advice
doch bitte in Zukunft
of
unterscheiden
others that we
zwischen
should
der
make a
New
distinction between the
Economy,
new
das war
economy,
Finanzmärkte
back in
und
2000, that was
Telekommunikation,
financial markets and
der
telecoms,
Old Economy,
and the old
das war,
economy,
wenn man ein Auto baut,
that was people who built
oder
cars,
Stahl oder Chemie
or steel,
oder
or
Maschinenbau.
chemicals, or mechanical engineering.
Wir haben nicht drauf gehört
We didn't listen.
und die drauf
to them.
gehört haben, müssen heute
And the
über
countries which did listen to it now need to talk about reindustrialization.
damals ausgelacht worden sind,
I know how
dass
people
wir
laughed at us back
der
then
Überzeugung waren, dass
when
es
we
nie
said
New
that
oder Old geht,
it's never a
sondern
question of
um
new
die
or old,
next economy.
it's just a question of the next economy.
Dass Deutschland
And that
zwei
Germany
Fähigkeiten hat, die wir
has two
vielleicht
abilities
besser beherrschen
which we're better
seit
at
rund 200 Jahren in der
for more than
Industrialisierung
200
als die
years
meisten
than
anderen.
most other countries.
Die zur Innovation
Innovation
und die zur Integration.
and integration.
Innovation neuer
Innovation
Verfahren
of
und
new
Produkte, die
procedures and products,
Integration in
and
die
the integration
vorhandene Produktions- und Dienstleistungsstruktur.
of the
Das
existing
konnten wir
products and
200 Jahre
services,
lang besonders
infrastructures.
gut in
We've been able to do that
unserem
really well over the last 200 years in this
Das können
country,
wir uns auch
and
heute.
I believe that
Deswegen
we'll continue to be able to do so.
ist bei der Debatte
So that's why,
die Industrie
when it comes to the
4.0
debate
und
about
die
Industry
nächste
4.0
industrielle
and the
Revolution
next
natürlich
industrial
ein Land,
revolution,
das über diese industriellen Fähigkeiten
when you have a
besser
country which
aufgestellt ist, ein Land,
has
das
these
diese
industrial
industriellen
capabilities,
Fähigkeiten
you're better positioned than a
letztlich
country
vernachlässigt hat.
which has
Amerika
neglected
redet
them.
übrigens auch über Reindustrialisierung. Haben
America is also
ungefähr
talking
die
about
Hälfte
reindustrialization,
an
and
Industrieanteil an ihrer Wertschöpfung wie Deutschland.
but
Ganz Europa redet auch darüber.
they don't have half of their
weil sie die
value added
industrielle
coming from industry like
Wertschöpfung
Germany,
vernachlässigt
and
haben. Aber
whole
ich gebe zu, es gibt auch einen
of
kleinen
Europe's talking about it because they've also neglected it. But
Das
also
sind die für
there's also
diese
a
vierte industrielle Revolution
disadvantage,
notwendigen Daten, Big
because the
Data,
data,
also
the big data you need for this fourth
dummerweise
industrial
nicht in
revolution,
Deutschland gesammelt werden,
isn't being collected in Germany,
sondern in
unfortunately,
4, 5 großen
but in 4 or
US-amerikanischen
5
Unternehmen
large
in
American
Kalifornien.
companies in California.
Ich fand das
Now,
eine Genugtuung, als
I
ich auf
was
der
very
CeBIT, also der
happy
größten
when I was at CeBIT,
Telekommunikationsmesse
the world's
der Welt,
largest telecommunications
im
and
Januar
IT
gesehen
fair.
habe, dass
I saw it back in January
der Vertreter
that the
der Old
representative of the
Economy,
old
der
economy,
Vorstandsvorsitzende
the
von
CEO of Volkswagen,
dort die Eröffnungsrede gehalten.
held the opening speech.
Davon haben wir im Jahr 2000 geträumt.
We
als sie
dreamt
uns
of that in
erzählen
2000
wollten,
when people were telling
das
us
sei alles von gestern.
that all that was yesterday's news.
Allerdings
But
habe ich so gedacht, na,
I thought, well,
Ob nicht ein paar Wochen später die Hannover
what would
Messe
happen?
Industrie mit den
Wouldn't it be good if a few weeks later the industrial trade fair in the Hanover Ferry Fair, we had it opened by an IT representative? I wasn't quite sure whether it might not be a major challenge for us. We have the industrial capabilities, but the data is something that other companies have. So when we talk about these opportunities, then you have the question of who will drive the innovation of the fourth industrial revolution. The traditional German industry, electrical engineering, mechanical engineering, chemicals, automotive engineering, or data companies like Google. But not only our own industrial capabilities should make ourselves more confident, but we also have a lot of startups in Berlin, for example, around the factory in Berlin, but once again supported by Google rather than by German companies. And that is an investment I would like to see more coming from the proud DAX-listed companies in Germany as well. I assume those people clapping come from the factory. Now, our country provides the world with the industrial products, but if we want to do that tomorrow as well, we need to digitize our industry. We need to drive ahead of that. I don't just mean the automated factory. I mean, in particular, intelligent services, smart services as an expanded value chain of industrial production. And here, once again, we need a younger generation of startups who can build business models from this. Making electricity and heat efficiently, transporting it, using it, networks, dwellings, buildings. All this is a major field for industrial IT applications, and we want to promote this, not least because digitalization is driving our energy reforms. Now, the most German of all industrial products, the car, is just being reinvented. It's being reinvented as a highly intelligent, networked, self-navigating computer on wheels, which is safer and more sustainable. That's a massive opportunity for all environmentalists, but also for all car enthusiasts. And generally, Germans tend to be both at once. They just ignore the other side of it all the time. Our new platform, Industry 4.0, will take up these issues and other innovations. I think we want to promote them, we want to encourage people, we want to spread optimism as we take on the opportunities. And in his last book, Eric Schmidt said that we need to do things which improve things by a factor of 10, not just by 10%. Moonshots is what he called them. Now, looking at the electoral results of my party, I'd be happy with a factor of 2. I don't know why you're all laughing there. But of course, this call to grasp at the moon shows that there's lots of room to move upwards. We need a new sense of entrepreneurship, we need new startups, we need resolution to engage in global competition in an age of digital economy and to succeed in the digital economy. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I deliberately took this opportunity to put the optimistic prospects at the beginning of my speech this evening, because I didn't want to put the focus solely on risks and concerns. There's not supposed to be typically German pessimism here. Because I think the last invention which people didn't criticize was the color TV, but it's about the things we need to do to create the opportunities here, but without ignoring the risks. And of course, therefore, we need to talk about the conditions in which we can avert risks and maintain the opportunities. And one central precondition for this is the digital sovereignty of the individual. And this starts with the question of the social interrelationships in which we want to use our data and which we want to network. It's not firstly and foremost a technical question, rather first and foremost is a question of, do we believe that our people, we need to change our image of people? No, I don't think we should. It's still about liberty and self-determination, sovereignty of each individual. And the internet is a democratic medium. Access to knowledge, social networking, expression of opinion are no longer just something for the elites. You can involve more and more people worldwide, and that's an egalitarian impulse. is an impulse of the modern age. At the same time, the internet is an interactive medium. In other words, people who use it themselves become themselves part of the digital world. They leave traces. They become a source of data. Nothing is free online. We pay at least with our data. Yes, the person becomes a product if he wants to use his data to earn money. There are neoliberal ideas and ideologists who believe that that has to be the aim. The total ability to market a person, he can use all his data. So the person becomes an object, and the aim is to mine his data. Well, digging rights in people is what a sharp critic of this sort of capitalism called it. And that's the difficult point in our contentious debate. And we agree a lot about the opportunities of digitization, but where we argue, we do it because we want to create a better networked future in which people can act freely and securely, protected from political, economic or other abuse. And I have to say, I find it remarkable, Mr. Eric Schmidt, how you are defending yourselves against political misuse. Just recently at a conference a few days ago in San Francisco, where you warned that the espionage is at risk of breaking up the internet. I should add, let's talk about the economic abuse of power in the data economy, because our idea of a liberal, free society doesn't just want to protect people against excess state power, but also against excess market power, or against individual companies. The German FDP forgot this basic law and wanted to let the market do everything. And this overbearing power of the market creates concerns for us. We're concerned that more and more personal data is collected and stored and compressed into profiles without that the people affected can actually be able to control that. Often they don't even know about it. Why, for example, does Google read the emails of the Gmail users? In our constitution, we have something rather old-fashioned called postal and telecommunications secrecy. This is a civil right, it's a fundamental right. It wasn't awarded to people by the state, rather people fought for it. It's an inalienable, fundamental right to be master of one's own data. Really does derive from the first article of our Constitution, that is, the human dignity is inviolable. It became, this right was set up when the first Democrats defended themselves against the spying and censorship of Prussia. And now we have to ask ourselves again, can we actually share news without being observed? And do we have still a civil right to confidential communication? And why do many internet services lock in their users so they find it difficult to switch between different platforms? Why do virtual trading places for books threaten other market participants, such as publishers, with aggressive methods and threats of boycotts? If you want a social market economy and fair competition, you will find this conduct more than odd. And if you want to live freely and in a sovereign way, you will not get used to the idea that you no longer can dispose of one's own data or that you can't delete them. The freedom of the individual must not be restricted by the monopolies of private companies. And here, as the guardians of competition, states bear a responsibility, and if necessary, they need to update their competition law. To put it very clearly, the Constitution and the fundamental rights of this country may come from the analog age, but they still apply in the digital age. They are universal, and they determine the nature of our coexistence. Every business model, every company, every technology, every algorithm must respect this concept of coexistence in Germany and Europe. And the application of these ideas coming from an analog world, this idea of the coexistence, can, I think, provide a very good compass for rules which we need to develop for the digital age. So it's really about the continuing existence of our democratic commonweal and the protection of civil rights. we have ways in which we can act on this. We have the basic data protection regulation, which will talk about the right to delete data and data portability. We can set up rules which, for internet platforms, which say that a search engine has to list the portals of its own companies according to the same rules as those of a rival. We can introduce a data quality mark for internet services which are particularly data protection friendly. So for decades, the success of the European market has been the guarantee that we have unique standards in terms of health, environment, or consumer, or social care, or health and safety at work. So every product is thoroughly tested before it's allowed onto the market in Europe. All the substances in every medicine have to be shown in a transparent way to the user. But on the other hand, every piece of software, every app just gets onto the market without any tests. It's totally intransparent, even though their use can have disastrous consequences for any user. Now, when choosing products and services, if you want to use them just as easily as when you walk through a shopping mall or a supermarket, then you need transparency. The long data privacy declarations or terms and conditions don't help us. Why does everything happen so? Well, if you want everything to be done so quickly, you need half a day to read all the terms and conditions on the internet. So it would be good. It's good to have a clear quality mark saying that data is only being used for the particular purpose to buy the product or to carry out the service, but not to draw up consumer profiles. And also the data are basically not forwarded. All these are steps towards a market system for the digital economy and for a modern data architecture which we urgently need. I certainly will be telling the new European Commission and the new Commissioner for the digital economy about our ideas about how to shape this order. Well, ladies and gentlemen, in the digital age which we've entered, data have become an economic asset to a sort of new gold standard. The fact is that people already were willing to share personal data than they were in the old analog world. So this makes it all the more important that we empower people to determine the use of the data themselves. Data sovereignty means to know who, what wants to save what, and for how long. To decide who I tell what. To be able to revise my decision, to get data back, and to delete data. Only if we succeed in that can we have confidence and trust. Only then can we shape an innovative digital economy for tomorrow, which is in the service of our society and which improves everybody's lives. Germany should certainly become part of the spearhead of a movement which embraces the opportunities of the digital world tomorrow, without fear, but also which does not leave the shaping of the digital revolution to the revolutionaries alone. That was never a good idea for Social Democrats. Rather, it gets them back into the arena of democratic legitimacy. Well, Eric Schmidt, those are my thoughts at the beginning of our discussion. And since I've heard that Data Liberation Front is also formed in your company, I'm particularly looking forward to your presentation. Welcome again, sir. Welcome to Berlin.
Mr. Vice Chancellor and everyone who is here, thank you so much for coming. In getting to know the Vice Chancellor and Minister as well, he's one of the great thinkers on how industries will evolve. And in his writings, which have affected a lot of people's thinking in America, he charts a course of modernization of what are traditionally called old industries, which neither the Chancellor nor I believe are old industries. Your vision has had a huge impact, and I agree with very much of it. So thank you very much. So when you invited me here, I had only one choice but to say yes. I think that one of the things to say about Germany is that you all are very tough on yourselves, and Germany is doing well. And Mr. Vice Chancellor, I think you're one of a small group of people who've made it so. So thank you on behalf of all of your citizens. So I'd like to speak about innovation and then address some of the questions that everyone has on their mind. Innovation is a process that's been going on forever, and I'm happy to be called the optimist, by the way, because I think the facts support my position, and I'm clear. When someone somewhere figured out tools that could help people live better, this is because of innovation. And it's a process filled with dreamers, all right, and with doers of equal measure, people who have a dream of what they can do, they set out goals, and then they make them happen. It's a process that it's a part of being human. Think of it as from the Gutenberg printing press to Stephenson's rocket train. These are all part of our history that we benefit from today. No one is anti-innovation, no one in this room for sure. So why is there a debate? Because it's messy. It's not linear, it's not smooth, it's not easy. It's full of trial and error. It tends to be inconvenient as well, and people are clearly disrupted from it. People don't wake up and say, oh, I'd like to have a technological revolution today, right? That's not what people say when they wake up in the morning. People debate, who benefits, right? The minority, the majority, the business or consumers. And the increased machines through the ages in agriculture, manufacturing, and now computing has always raised the question, well, what about the humans? What about the people? Now, it's obviously impossible to predict the future, but if you look at the Industrial Revolution, there was a massive increase in automation and a significant improvement in working standards. And working hours went from roughly 70 hours to roughly 40 hours over 150 years. And they're likely to go down in the future, our children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. GDP per capita rose from $847 in 1800 to $12,700 today, accounting for inflation, with increasing literacy and life expectancy. Until the 1600s in Europe, the average person died before 30. This building was a hospital. Imagine a world with no hospitals. And think about how much better we are today because of innovation. So job creation and growth are clearly a priority for Europe, and I believe the digital economy is part of the solution here. Recent research, which I've been studying, has shown that on a net basis, jobs are created by what are called gazelles, relatively new companies that are growing quickly, right, that are inventing new things in medicine, in the digital world, in engines, in cars, in everything. According to the OECD, over 1/3 of all net new jobs created between 2001 and 2011 came from firms less than 5 years old and fewer than 50 employees. By the way, one of the great stories about Germany is this extraordinary infrastructure of small and medium businesses that are throughout the countryside of Germany that power the Industrial Revolution that the rest of us purchase from you as an exporting country. And of course, these companies then create a virtual cycle where the employees become entrepreneurs and new companies are formed. So I argue that it's our duty to our children and grandchildren, to all the people, to keep that cycle going. And as the Vice Chancellor has argued, you need a climate that fosters risk-taking, is accepting of failure, government spending on R&D and real investment in education and training, access to capital, and fast, plentiful internet access. Germany, a wonderful country, is not the leader in internet access, especially in the rural areas. This is something where you could fix this relatively quickly with a little bit more spending, right? That would have huge impact on the leverage and knowledge of your workers. We're trying to do our part. We've obviously supported the factory here in Berlin, as well as the same things in London, Paris, and Madrid. We're doing initiatives to promote jobs of one kind or another. And we've just launched Google Ventures in Europe with a fund of 80 million euros to get started to invest. And we're likely to increase that quite significantly to help fund these companies that I'm talking about. So my view is people, all of us, are the biggest winners with this increased choice and freedom. We now have basically the ability to find anything just by typing it into a computer. And it's unimaginable, the relationships, the connectivity, the sharing. We have example after example here in Germany of small businesses that now have global customers because of the internet. People could find them, they could purchase their products, they were shipped out of them. It's a huge revenue driver for them. Now, of course, there's been disruption for sure. And online competition for eyeballs and advertising euros have clearly compounded the challenges that newspapers were already having, which started really with television, competing with them. We worked hard to support that industry with their products and platforms. Each month, for example, German news publishers get 500 million clicks from Google, which people estimate are worth 12 to 16 cents per click. So it's a lot of money going into them to help them. The digital platforms have also established new opportunities for existing players. Research by the German Institute for the Economy found that 28,000 employees and 100,000 jobs were created between 2007 and 2011 in Germany with Google's help, because Google was here, and we hope to stay, obviously. And with mobile app stores like the Apple App Store and Google Play allow developers to grow their businesses. Look at WhatsApp, right? In a few years, they created a business that was purchased for on the order of $18 billion by somebody else, 600 million users. That's scale, that's impact. Now, there's a lot of discussion in Germany as to whether platforms like Google are a utility. Are we an essential facility that people are locked into? Do you have a choice? And of course, I would say that these are one of many windows onto the web. I can give you many examples. Here in Germany, Germans go to get their news. I think the top-rated newspaper is Bild, B-I-L-D, and 70% of those users go straight to Bild. They don't go through Google, they don't go through Facebook, they don't go through anybody else. Only 10% go through Google. There's lots of other examples. If you want to buy something, you can obviously use Google or Bing or Yahoo or something called Quant, which is a new French search engine. But you're much more likely to, as a consumer, to go to Amazon or Zalando. It turns out that almost a third of the people looking for things actually start on Amazon. They don't start on Google. So the concept that somehow Google is a holder or a gate is just not based on reality. So if you want travel information, right, another example, there's lots of choice. Of course, there's Google, but there's also Kayak, Apoto, or Lufthansa, Booking.com, Airbnb for hotels, Avis for your rental car, and Money Supermarket for insurance. Local information is another important category. Get me to a local plumber, right? Would you do that for Google? You're much more likely to use Yelp, TripAdvisor, DoYou, Chow, or Holiday Check. So my point is, Google is certainly not the only site being used, and in many cases, we're not the most popular. And of course, there's even mobile. I'm going to quote from The Economist, of which I'm a board member. Mobile devices have changed the way people travel the internet. Users now prefer apps to websites' home pages. That's interesting. They're moving from Google to vertical apps that are on these mobile phones. And the most interesting thing is that now a majority of searches is coming from mobile, not from desktop. Only 40% from desktop. So there's a huge shift going, which, by the way, Germans are participating in with new apps and new other products to mobile devices, whether they're Android or Apple phones. 7 out of every 8 minutes of mobile phone usage is spent within apps. And by the way, the most famous app in the world is not Google, it's Facebook. Hard for me to say, but these are the facts. We also hear a lot about network effects. It's often used as a dirty word. But in fact, I would argue that network effects make things useful. Imagine a telephone where there's no other phone to call, right? Clearly, you benefit by having everyone connected to the same network. What about a social network where you're the only person? Well, that's a pretty lonely social network. You don't have any friends. Clearly, there's a benefit, right, to having other people on this network. You don't use Google, by the way, because your friends do. You use Google because Google does something that's useful to you, different in that regard. We hear the same kinds of arguments being made about data. You don't really need data to compete online, although Google certainly has a lot, as do everybody else. When Google started, the largest player was Yahoo, much, much larger. But I would say that we had a better algorithm, we had a better approach, we had a better search engine. Our engineers just did a better job at the time, more than 10 years ago, and people switched from one to the other. Could the same thing happen? Of course. I would say to you that it's the recipe that matters more than the ingredients. We have spent an enormous amount of time trying to earn your trust. And we need to show that we are worthy stewards of your information. Privacy and security matter enormously, and these are two sides of the same coin. You cannot have one without the other, as recent hacking of, for example, the iCloud celebrities showed. That's why, for example, after the NSA and the British Secret Service attacked Google, we promoted throughout our service heavy encryption, so-called 2048-bit encryption, which is unbreakable by them or by anybody else. We focused and led the industry around something called two-factor authentication. We also want users to have the choice of deleting information that we have that they don't want us to have. If you go to your Google account, you can look at your account history. You can see what you've searched for, where you've been, essentially, all those things, the videos you've watched, and you have control. You can delete all of it, or some of it, or none of it. The user has control. You can do this the moment we're done out of this meeting, or right now if you use your mobile phones. And we, in fact, publicize how many people do this. 10 million people visited these pages between late August and early September. These are enormously popular. People care a lot about privacy, as the Vice Chancellor said. It's interesting, 200,000 turned off their YouTube search history and 80,000 turned off their location history. Now, over the last 24 hours, I've been here to Berlin, which is a city I love, and a lot of people have asked me whether Google sells personal data. And the answer is, we do not. The answer is no. We do not sell advertisers the details of what you've searched for, nor the details of the websites that you visited, or we don't sell what is in your email or the profiles in any way. We simply match advertisers to search queries. We sell advertising space. We don't sell your identity. I hope that's very clear. I want to finish by a strong message by addressing, I think, the real issue, which frankly is the United States. I think many of us, I suspect all of us, are committed Atlanticists and longtime supporters of free trade. But the relation between Germany and the United States has become strained, I think in many cases because of the Edward Snowden disclosures. I have personally met with the President of the United States to discuss this, and I've told him, and I will say to you, that the behavior of the United States government was outrageous. Just because you can do something, right? Just because you can do something doesn't mean that you should do it. It was wrong, and it has seriously hurt more than Google, more than the existing governments. It's hurt a bond that started more than 60 years ago, and that bond is incredibly important. I think that this stoked much of this concern that somehow this digital innovation regime was going to be controlled by the Americans and not by Europe. And I think it's crucial that Europeans play up, join this party, invest in broadband, invest in universities, invest in the great talent that are in this country. I know this because Google hires them. I know that they're here. We know your people are good because we have checked. This is not, right? This is not that complicated. So, first place, in America, we need surveillance reform. We are working hard in our Senate and House, which don't do very much these days, to try to get them to actually fix these problems. They are not yet fixed, but we agree, all of us, very strongly. Second, I think US companies need to continue to invest heavily in Europe for many reasons, including the fact that it's good for Europe. We have more than 9,000 employees in Europe, and we've invested more than 4 billion euros in capital in the last 4 years, all across Europe. We have large engineering sites here in Germany, no surprise, right? And a significant hiring and investment here. We need governments, including this government, to support pro-innovation policies, as Mr. Vice Chancellor, you have argued for in, I think, a very, very strong way. You have said that the digital economy can help fire up a whole new generation of German startups, and we completely agree. And I think it's central and crucial for the success of Germany over the next 5 to 10 years. You'll do fine for the next year or two, but in 5 years or 10 years, you need to do this. Now, how can established businesses worry? How could Google worry about startups? After all, you can't stop Microsoft, Yahoo, BlackBerry. Do you get my point? 10 years ago, there was a completely different regime. Today, there's one set of leaders, and in a decade, there will be others. The competition is so difficult, and I will say that history has shown time and time again that size and past success are no guarantee. I was sure that Xerox and Bell Labs, where I worked for both places, were unslayable giants in technology. But the lead has moved elsewhere. Change comes from where you least expect it. And let me finish by telling the following story. The telegraph disrupted the postal service. Radio and television shook up the news industry. Airplanes ended the age of ocean liners. The next Google won't do what Google does, just as Google didn't do what AOL did. Inventions are always dynamic. This is the process of innovation. Germany has everything that it needs to be a global player in this new digital revolution with a little bit of work. Thank you so very much, Mr. Vice Chancellor, and all of you.
Please stay. Would you mind to have a seat now? We would like to start the discussion. Der Minister kommt dazu und wir beginnen gleich die Diskussion. Thank you very much, Mr. Schmidt, for sharing your view with us. Wir wollen zunächst
Now, first of all, we want to have a brief dialogue up on the stage, and then you will have the opportunity to ask questions, either here in this hall or via the social media. Don't forget the hashtag Wirtschaft für morgen. Mr. Schmidt, and there's no denying that Google, in commercial and technological terms, Google is a massive success story. It's used by people, it's used by companies, and really, everybody should love you and applaud you. But that's not always the case. Particularly here in Germany, people are very skeptical. What explanation do you yourself have for that?
I believe that it's primarily because people are concerned about their privacy online. I have believed for a long time that the industry does a bad job of protecting users. And every year or two, every month or two now, you see an example where credit cards are stolen or personal data is made available. Google has not had those problems. But I think there is a deep fear of what could happen to people because of accidents and errors and bad people online. And that's my real guess.
Okay. Kommen wir erstmal in einen Dialog mit.
Well, we'll start a dialogue. Mr. Gabriel, a question to you. In the past, you have really been criticizing Google very much, and you mentioned two risks of the digital revolution in your presentation: the transparency of people. You talked about sovereignty of the individual, data sovereignty of the individual, and you talked about the market power of major digital companies. Schmidt just said, well, Google isn't omnipotent. Is that true? Isn't he understating it? Well, I don't say they're omnipotent, but I do believe that in a world which lives from generating data and networking data and building business models from that data, you have to ask yourselves, do you want to allow everything to happen in that networking? Do you have to allow all that networking? Do you want a set of glasses developed by Google to film me in a public space? Do I want my employer to have access to my health data? Because wearing a watch at work can already show people how healthy I am. And I would say, no, I don't want that. At least I want the person who is exposed to such a development can decide whether he wants it or not. And the second point is, of course, the company which has gigantic quantities of data, that's aggregated these data, will be in a good position to use a business model, be in a better position to use this data for a business model than other companies. And this means if we compare, for example, the analog economy, well, if he's already so powerful, let's not take Google, let's take Facebook. He's right. Let's take Facebook. Would we quite simply say that it's okay that they buy up WhatsApp? Then you'd have antitrust law, and if we went to the competition authorities here, the cartel authorities, you see the turnover of WhatsApp is very low, but the quantity of data is massive. Is our cartel law, our antitrust law, enough in terms of just to look at the turnover, or do we not also need to further develop our antitrust law to say there have to be barriers at some point so that you don't have one segment which becomes larger and larger in terms of the data quantity, and then you have another part of the economy which is dependent on that data and is dependent on that company holding all the data? I think there's normal market-based questions you have to ask. And the fact that Schmidt says, well, we're quite small and nobody really notices us, he's right. He can say that if he wants, but we'll have to see if that's true. Mr. Schmidt, well, you are getting a lot of... just to say this, I admire Google, but I also admire an engineer who has the capability to build a car. Even then, despite that, I think we should have road traffic rules. So, I think it's a fantastic company, but you have to see whether this company needs rules to obey, and I think it does. Well, let's pass this question straight across. This criticism is not only expressed by Mr. Gabriel, but you hear it from other politicians from other countries as well. From Brussels, from the EU, for example. There's an antitrust case you have to face up to there, for example. The most important call, I think, of many people is greater transparency. So it's a question of data sovereignty, what the minister was talking about. Is this an argument which you can avoid in your company? Perhaps it's an argument you face up to, maybe to avoid a bad image?
We are generally in favor of more data transparency. And it's interesting that the Vice Chancellor mentioned the glasses. We do not allow the use of glasses for surveillance for precisely the reasons that the Vice Chancellor mentioned. And we understood that if people wandered around with cameras surveilling people, it would be bad and it would also lead to laws. So we are trying very hard to anticipate these concerns as best we can, right? which I think the Vice Chancellor has laid out fairly well.
Ja, natürlich, bitte sehr.
Can I ask a question? Yes. I just was asking, why does Google read Gmail?
Well, in fact, we don't. What happens is we have, it's important to know, let me just tell you exactly what we do. When a Gmail comes in, we have a computer algorithm that looks at the words and does a mathematical calculation which determines what ad is shown. There are no humans involved, and there's not stored, that information is not sold or done anything, and the advertiser doesn't know what the email is about. So in that sense, it's ad targeting. We don't read it in the sense of comprehension.
Darf ich ein schwieriges...
May I offer a different example, a more difficult one? You recently said proudly that you caught somebody who was using child pornography. Now, everyone would say, thank goodness for that. Really, these people should be caught and they should be stopped. But we in Germany would nevertheless say that it's not up to a private company to do that. We would still say the right, take an old-fashioned concept, the confidentiality of post and telecommunications is part of the state's monopoly on force to prosecute such things. If that's true, that you do not read it, how could you know that he was dealing in child porn? I mean, obviously we're split on this. We're glad that the man was caught. Yeah, but on the other hand, we think, what else are they reading?
So, again, I understand a very legitimate concern. If someone tells us someone is doing something illegal, we will take a look at it. So, in child porn, somebody would say there was child porn. We don't know how to look with a computer for child porn. We can't find it, right? So what happens is somebody tells us, and then we report it to the authorities, and then the government does whatever the government's going to do.
So if you say that you don't use certain data to pass on personal profiles, what about the idea of a data quality mark? Would you be in favor of that? Say we comply with the quality mark?
In general, we are. And the reason is that we like restrictions on the use of data, and in general, we support many of the European data privacy rules. So the requirement for notice, the requirement that people understand what's happening, in general, we do. We're not opposed to all of these things.
So we're writing all this down, yeah? And we find it very good.
Mr. Vice Chancellor, the reason is because if we don't, then users will go somewhere else because they have a choice.
Yeah. Trotzdem noch mal nach.
But he's pretty clever, isn't he? He's pretty cute. Well, yes. Oh, come on, the audience are also supposed to ask questions, and there's supposed to be a dialogue, and you have the opportunity to follow up. I want to ask one more question first. Google is the largest internet provider, is the market leader in all the areas. In Germany, people in Germany are very worried about the dominant position that Google has, as its power, and about the volume of data that Google disposes of, and we don't know what Google's doing with it, basically. Can you imagine that we in Germany, because of our experience, because of our German history, are particularly concerned about private companies which have this sort of monopoly, this sort of dominant position? How do you handle that?
Well, I'm very well aware of the history of Germany and in particular of East Germany, and apparently the National Security Agency was not, right? It's amazing to me that Americans would be so insensitive given the history of Germany. But Google is well aware of these concerns, and indeed when we did Street View in 2008, for the first time, we allowed people ahead of time to have information about their houses that we would picture from a public street deleted from Street View. So I think we have been unusually sensitive, and correctly so, because of the unique nature of German concerns. So I understand the question. You think we have a lot of data and you don't know what we're doing with it, which is the way you said it. But I'm happy to answer questions what we do with it. And so the answer is, we do assemble the data. We delete your search history over about a year, so we don't have it after that. If you want to get rid of it, if you're very concerned right now about surveillance by Google, you can use a mode called incognito, which means that we know nothing about you. And Google performs extremely well with that.
Herr Google sage ich jetzt schon. Herr Gabriel.
Mr. Gabriel, Mr. Google, I said Mr. Google, I mean Mr. Gabriel.
Ja, das Wort geht, das ist, man spukt ja nur.
You can't help using the word Google, can you? My goodness me. Anyway, is that what we want? We want to be a transparent individual who has to ensure that his data are not stored, and then has to find out if it was stored and what has been stored about me, and has to take the trouble to find out to go and get things deleted? No, of course, that's not what we want. We are moving into this sort of area, and the first step would be really to have a quality mark so that the consumer knows that if I use that, I don't need to read the data privacy rules or the general terms and conditions. I know they're not going to keep my profile, they're not going to pass on my data. I think so a sort of smiling at or something like that would be a data quality mark which we could use. And the second step would be that you still have to regulate. You need to have a basic data protection regulation in Europe. For example, you need to have the point that a company active on a market needs to observe the rules of that market in Europe. And then, do you have market power which makes other people dependent or not? That's a difficult question to answer. Google and Eric Schmidt take the position it doesn't really exist. There are a lot of other people, and who knows who will be around in a year. And if you look at the press people in Germany, they say, well, the fact that they don't disclose their algorithms, and that certain offers suddenly appear at the top. It always seems to be Google offers, and the offers of others who offer the same thing are ranked down. Those are debates which I think we need to have in Germany. And I'm glad that the European Commission has suspended the procedure, because I found it a bit odd that the offer of Google was accepted by the Commission, that the rival is allowed to advertise on Google, so he appears as well. I found that a bit like as though basically the person to be executed has to pay the last meal, and I didn't find it very good, to be honest. It wasn't adequate. But we are now entering into these debates, and I have to admit, it's not easy to handle these debates, because we need to make sure that we don't kill business models. We've got a company that's successful. Why have they got a 90% market share? It's because people like what they're doing. You know, how can we balance this? And that's where we're moving towards. But I don't think that today we can say that we can be happy with the rules we got. Think about the question, how do we deal with the dispute about Google News using press products and not paying for them? I find a bit of an odd business model myself. So, well, I think that if somebody uses an intellectual work of another to generate traffic to get adverts, then they're using somebody else's asset, and I think it's normal to pay for it.
Okay, so, but of course that's a very old-fashioned analog view. I do realize that. Show of hands, please. I don't want to open the biggest debate, but I agree with your view. But in this particular case, the editor can agree to whether they want to agree to this being used or not, and Springer has said no. So Springer can decide whether they want these snippets to be handed over for Google to use, so they can decide. So I think it's fair enough. Yes, but that's because of the 90% market share that Google has. So if that's an argument that you use to defend Google, then I would be careful in your place, because if you have a 90% market share, then there is an indication that whoever does not participate in paying will at the end up with a problem, because if you pay, you'll have a problem, and then Google will have this big market share. So that's another view to take. So I think the best way would be to just be an honorable merchant. If you use someone else's property, then you talk to them, then you agree on a price. I think that it should be just normal. That's normal behavior. And I personally am really happy whenever I don't have to create new regulation. Okay, so there's a question over there, and I think there were quite a few people here, and we agreed that we'll hear several questions in a row before you answer them. Okay. Okay, so I'm from the ministry. I'm responsible for IT policy, and I have a question for Mr. Schmidt. There are some very well-known economists in the IT sector who say that digitization in the US has generated a lot of growth, but not necessarily much in terms of employment. So don't you think there is a danger that the creative people, the smart ones, the clever people, the ones who we also support in our ministry, win, but that Mr. Schmidt, Ms. Jones lose out, so that maybe we only need half as many officials in this ministry to supply our minister with the information he needs, because Google will do the rest. So don't you think that digitization does not lead to a race havens versus machines? Okay, so that's question number one. Mr. Harald Welzer from the Foundation for Future 2. I have a question and a remark. Question for Mr. Schmidt. I am slightly disappointed, to be honest, because I expected a little more from the CEO of one of the most important companies in the world. You just pretend to be completely naive. You say that you're very concerned, that you share our concerns, and that you are also really horrified by everything that can happen in these developments. But at the same time, you're the one developing Glass, you're the one developing Street View, you're the one developing algorithms. Your entire business model is all about mining data that you've collected from people, and of further and further extending this activity. So it's not really credible if you say that you are also concerned about what might happen with the data that you gather. And so I would like to ask you to give me a more intelligent response. Maybe you can really defend the fact that you are a company that is just addicted to collecting data. Another question, please. Hello, Gözer. I have a question about censorship. Google and Android, you have a market share of 70%. So
moving massive amounts of apps and money with those apps is another. Now, in fact, Google has some issues or have some guidelines what sort of content it wants to see on Google Play. Now, it's not really transparent, and the sentences are more like, you better do nothing because we can throw you out at any time, and there is no phone to ring, nobody to ask. I've worked in Saudi Arabia, I've worked in Egypt, in Turkey, and in Indonesia on censorship with the movie industry. But there was always somebody to talk about. With Google, there's never anybody to talk about. You just ban, and then you ban everything the company has on your website. So it's a danger for anybody to violate or supposedly violate your laws, just like a Turkish journalist who is afraid to write something. Self-censorship. I would love to hear about that. Thank you.
Okay, vielleicht noch eine weitere Frage dort, bitte.
Maybe we can have one more question. Good evening, my name is Robert Meyer. I am an internet startup person here in Berlin, and I'm one of the people who complained to the European Commission about abuse of market power, market dominance. And you gave us a very nice quote: just because you can do something, you shouldn't necessarily do it. It's wrong. And that's exactly our view. Many of your products are excellent, but some of them are not so good. And you just place them on top of your search results list, just because you can. And really, you should be competing with SMEs on the best product. So why do you place your products on top, even though you have so many products that actually are better, that can win on merit? And why don't you use your own rules when you deal with your own projects? And then, as a private individual, I have another question. Gmail. I thought that the question that Mr. Gabriel asked was very interesting, but I didn't think your answer was quite full, because or was quite satisfactory, because in our view it would be a judge who would have to say when someone can actually open a letter or snoop in a way. And who is the one who decides when you pass on information to the authorities? Is it when somebody violates or commits tax fraud or something? Would you pass that on to the authorities? And then also you said we needed to invest more in high-speed internet. That's maybe a question that you can just give us a knee-jerk answer to. What do you think? How long will it take? How long would it take, if you paid your taxes in Germany, how long would it take for that to pay for internet in even the remotest corners of Germany? Okay, so we'll have a round of answers. Let's start with the last one. Paying taxes. You're laughing about this.
No, I'm laughing at you guys laughing. So let me see if I can answer, and I'm sorry that my answers were not as crisp as you would like. So let me give you crisper answers, and hopefully I can answer your questions. The first question was actually about the hollowing out of the middle class, unrelated to Google. And let me just say that economists don't agree on what's going to happen. I've been working on this for about a year myself as my project. And I think the evidence is that, the historical evidence is that if we make people smarter, which Google and other companies will do, including German companies, they will have higher wages. And I believe that Germany will be especially benefited by this because of the quality of education and the quality of the workforce, which Germans should be proud of. I think the countries that will be hit the worst are countries which are not Western democracies. They don't have good educational systems. They're using labor in ways that are easily replaced by machines and by computers. I understand the point that you made, which is somehow that a computer will replace a knowledge worker. You said that in your ministry you won't have as many workers because computers will be so smart. But I think that the truth will be the other, that the opportunity, the choices, the creativity, and the challenges of your ministry, you'll need more people, but they'll also need better tools. And that is my opinion on how that. You won't find agreement on this. Now let's go through some of the more direct charges about Google. The first question was a comment about data mining. And the assertion was that we're not being truthful because our company is doing things like Glass and others, but that our entire business model depends on data mining. It doesn't depend on data mining. 97% of our money comes from advertising. And our advertisement is done using a computer algorithm that's tied to what you're searching against and the clicking on ads. So again, when you say data mining, I assume you mean detailed analysis of people and their behavior, where they are and what they're doing. We don't do that. We don't keep, for example, the information that's on a mobile phone about where you are for precisely these reasons. We have to pay for the company somehow. We chose to pay it with ads that are optional for you to click on. All right? So I hope that's a clear answer. Let's see, there was another question about Let's go through the list.
Es war noch eine Frage da oder ein Statement.
There was another statement or question. Google isn't transparent. There are no contacts. That was the question of censorship.
On the question of Android and the Play Store, we wrote out what we believe the rules are. And unlike the web, we want to make sure that the Play Store does not have malware or bad applications. So we tried our best. Android is different from the iPhone in that the iPhone you have to have pre-approval, whereas in Android you can put it up, and then if someone complains, we will take it down. And that's what you're seeing. So it's not censorship in the sense that you're describing, but the fact of the matter is, in the case of the Android store, the Android user wants to know that the application is not going to be full of viruses, and that's why we do that. As far as I know, the rules are fairly clear, and if they're not clear, I'll try to make that more clear. Another question that you asked, you were a complainant with respect to Brussels. The specifics are more subtle, and you'd have to tell me the names of the companies that you're referring to. There's a set of companies that are aggregators. And so what happens is you go to Google, and then you go to this other company, and then you go to another company to buy something. And we have found in our testing that users want to go straight to the company. And we believe that getting the user to that answer quickest is the right answer. And we believe that that's how we operate. That's what we say. And in the testimony that we gave to Brussels, that is precisely what we told them. We entered into an agreement after 3.5 years of negotiation, which is now being revised, we'll see what happens, where we agreed to actually show some of these links in parallel, even though it looks like users don't want to click on them, so that we could make sure we respected the European law. With respect to the taxes, we operate under the same international tax regime that the German companies do working in the United States. And we use the Ireland path, which many American companies do. Dublin announced on Tuesday that they are changing that, and we welcome those changes, and we will fully comply. So.
Gut,
I think that needs some clarification. So, finally, Dublin has decided, or Ireland has decided, that it will no longer offer zero tax regime. But at the same time, I would like to say that you can't really find fault with a company simply for exploiting legal loopholes that are there. So if the European states are too stupid to set up a proper tax system, then, well, then that's not really the company's fault. So we would have a lot more revenue if we had proper tax systems. Ms. Silva-Gabada has looked at the communication on the social media, and I think there are some questions, so maybe we can hear about that. Data privacy, of course, is very important, and the social media, on the social media as well. Then there's another question. User responsibility. What do you think the user's role is? What are his responsibilities? And do you think that users should have more responsibility? Mr. Schmidt, you said that users have the opportunity to delete their search queries, but of course there are other areas where more could be left for the user to decide. So that's an interesting question, I think, that we could pass on. Mr. Schmidt?
It turns out that this question we worked on very hard over the last decade with the European regulators. And you could imagine that we would keep no data at all. However, there are public safety reasons why some data is retained. So the ultimate compromise was between 12 and 18 months, which was driven by the European data protection authorities at the time.
Dankeschön. Hier vorne bitte.
Thank you. I'm State Secretary for Consumer Protection, and over the past few months I looked at various portals which are very important for consumers because they rate services and products. So this is highly important for consumers, and you can simply answer my question by saying yes or no. Would Google be ready to give Google Shopping to submit Google Shopping to the same rules as its competitors? Because that would actually create an equal, a level playing field that we don't have at the moment. So there are about 1,500 people in Germany who work in this area and who, in this area of comparing prices, for instance. This is a service that is very good. And there are people who offer better services than Google Shopping.
I must confess, I'm a little bit perplexed by the abdication of responsibility whenever you say that it's not Google that does it, it's the algorithm. So it's the algorithms that collect the data. Google created these, people created them, and I think it's really dangerous when you start to talk about these things as though they have no relation to people and that therefore you have no responsibility for them.
Bitte sehr.
Nico Lummer from the Center for Digital Function 66. Thank you very much for the statements. In your statement, Mr. Gabriel, you talked about digital sovereignty. That's a very important point. And Mr. Schmidt, you said, well, just simply change your name once you've completed college. So maybe not everyone can do that. And my question is, how can I regain my sovereignty? Well, as a young person, it was possible for me to do some stupid things without that having any impact on my future. And I think that has changed. And we need to find ways of dealing with this, because there are so many data streams, and we somehow need to make sure that we keep private things private and not to make them available to a semi-public. Good evening. I have a question for Mr. Schmidt and also for the Vice-Chancellor. My name is Henry Bese. I'm from Energy Franco-Allemande, and what our association tries to do is to build bridges between France and Germany. So you said, Mr. Schmidt, that we don't know what the next Google is going to be. So what can Mr. Gabriel do, or what can his French counterpart do to make sure that the next Google will be based in Europe? I think Paris is one of the capitals for German startups. Paris is another important hub. So what can policymakers in Europe do in order to make sure that we have this kind of innovation here and not only in the US? And then maybe one more question, and then we'll have the rounds of answers. Christian Friesek. I am a member of the German Parliament, and I have a question for Mr. Schmidt. You said that you have one international business model, but of course you are held accountable to different legislations, and in some cases they can be contradictory to the point where it can be very difficult for your business model to remain viable, because you have a business model that's very much based on trust and confidence. And you said that you said what you said to the American administration. You said that you have problems there, but how do you want to handle these conflicts that you are coping with?
So, Herr Schmidt, do you want to start? Mr. Schmidt, do you want to start with the first one, or how do you want to do it?
I made a list, and so let me see if I can answer. So with respect to Google Shopping, we are subject to German law and German regulation. So I'm not sure, maybe I didn't understand your question, but we, of course, have to be fully compliant with German regulations, German laws, all the things that you and your ministry do. I can't imagine any other answer, right? For the lady who mentioned abdication of responsibility, the Google algorithms are written by Google employees, and Google owns them. If I created a misimpression, again, I apologize. We are in charge of the algorithms that we write. So I was not suggesting we aren't in charge. Maybe, again, I missed your point. But Google, the engineers write software programs that make these decisions. They're not made by humans, they're made by software programs written by humans that Google owns, in the sense of owning the algorithm. With respect to the sovereignty question, you made a comment about changing your name. That was a joke that I gave 10 years ago. there's a very, very serious issue about young people being online and doing things that they regret later. And indeed, the European Court of Justice has just ruled in May that if you're not a public figure and the information is not generally relevant, Google must take it down, right, under those criteria. And we are running a process to try to figure out the complicated cases. There's obvious cases like the ones you mentioned. So we are subject to that law. My own opinion is that the European Parliament and laws won't change much. So this European Court of Justice decision will stand for some years. And so we're all going to be implementing that, and I think that answers your question. You asked the question about what can European political leaders do to make sure that the next Google is in Germany or in Paris. And I think a lot of it has to do with recognizing that there's a problem, right? Trying to figure out what the barriers are, and I have a list, and then having good government support for the private sector and entrepreneurs. And I'll tell you what I observe as some of the problems are the internet is not strong enough in terms of its capability. There are laws which make it difficult to do small companies very quickly in Europe. And unfortunately, France is one of the worst because of some of the specific employment laws. And those, again, are not competitive with some of the other countries in Europe. And so, again, that has to be discussed. Perhaps you could imagine changing those laws for very small companies, making exemptions. That would be helpful. And there are situations where regulations prohibit certain kinds of startups that would be possible in other countries that would be, for example, legal in the UK but not legal in France. And so my message to all of the political leaders is meet with the entrepreneurs and ask them what their problems are and try to fix them, right? The good news is you have the people. In Berlin, I've had many lunches and dinners now with young entrepreneurs who are just as good as the ones in America, right? So they have all the same ideas and so forth. There's nothing holding you back from doing that, except to make sure that there's nothing in these people's way. And the last question, I must say, I didn't quite understand the trust and confidence point, Minister. The reality is we do have to apply by local laws. We have a global model, but it has to be adapted per country. And we've done that in some cases, certainly in Germany.
I would like to raise two questions, or talk about two questions. First of all, I've learned two things. The question from the State Secretary, Gabriel, whether Google would accept that when you get a shopping offer, look at a shopping offer, that Google should assess the Google company in just the same way as other companies and apply the same quality criteria to it. The answer was Google would adhere to German law. As sort of obvious, it seems to me, but what I obviously need to do is to make very sure that German and European law has to be changed so that we can look at the algorithm. Because that's where the problem is. Because only if I can see the algorithm can I answer the question as to whether you treat the platforms in the same way. I don't really want to do it. First of all, algorithms change at high speed. And secondly, maybe I have no interest in having a massive monitoring bureaucracy that somehow contradicts, the whole thing contradicts the business model of a digital economy. So I would like you just simply to say, answer yes to his question. Because if Google itself has its own business model and ensures that the qualitative criteria are decisive as to whether you are top of the listing or bottom of the listing, you don't need any state regulation. But if the answer is, I obey German European law, then you're calling for regulation. Okay, we'll do it if you want. Sure. But I'd rather prefer the other model. And politicians usually have the reputation of liking every law they make, just as a sort of source of legitimacy. But I find it better the other way around, not to have laws. And before you answer, what can we do to ensure that the ecology is right here. Everything that I agree with everything Erich Schmidt said about that. But there's something that politicians can't change, and that is the culture and the willingness to provide funding for growth. We are quite good at funding startups in Germany, and we're doing some tax improvements and so on. But what we're not good at is financing growth. When you've got a company, I guess it wants to go into the international market to scale up, to take advantage of the opportunities of a networked world. Then these companies in Germany have a really tough time, because the market 2.0 doesn't exist yet. We're still talking about we're talking about it with the German Stock Exchange. We all know we need something like that. Just to give you an example, a company which starts and says, I'll buy shares. So then the carry forward of losses, which it had before, for tax purposes, can no longer be claimed. So it has to pay taxes on those previous losses. So I don't think that's a good idea. We're trying to change the tax laws, and now it's ended up before the European Court. But there's a whole range of things which make it hard to grow here, and then companies get an offer to go to another part of the world, and there, if you have a Silicon Valley which has $15 billion of venture capital a year, I don't think we can create that, but the German economy, it's really not up to the state to act here. It cannot always be the case that if we want money, we have to set up another state bank. Rather, the German economy has to have a culture in which we don't offer venture capital in homeopathic doses. And I can't do that as a regulator. That's a culture we need to build up. And the rest of the things we need to do as Erich Schmidt described them. And the culture of investing in the growth of a company is not some part of one's own business model. It may be something completely different. You only do it if you think it's part of our entrepreneurial culture. I think that's something we really need to build up in Germany. Otherwise, all the best regulation won't help us at all.
I think I understand better your question. You were speaking of something called Google Product Search. And this is something that we have spent a long series of discussions in Brussels with the European antitrust over. And in the deal that was announced by the commissioner, we agreed to show 3 results through our system and three results from everybody else at the same level, both in terms of text and pictures. So we've answered that question by saying we were willing to do that because of the sort of, if you will, the regulatory view. There's a problem with what you said, which is that sometimes the sites are themselves aggregators of products, and the customers, when they go into those sites, actually become dissatisfied fairly quickly. And we know this because we've tested this. And so it is not as simple as you described, there's 3 that are better and so forth. It's more complicated. But nevertheless, we felt that it was appropriate to move forward by making this agreement, which is not today in place. And we'll see if it comes in place over the next few months as the new commission gets formed. So I understand your point. We want to make sure that these people have an opportunity to showcase their wares. We also want to make sure that everybody remembers that our goal is keeping the user happy, not the partner, not the business, and not even Google shareholders. And that is our view.
Well, we've overrun a bit, but so many people want to take the floor that perhaps we should have one last round of questions if you're happy with that. Yes? Yes? Yes, somebody wanted the floor here. Henning Tillman, free software developer from Berlin. I could only be in Berlin and do it in Berlin. Perhaps we should say that to the cabinet colleague of the Bavarian Party, we need broadband everywhere. I couldn't do my job if I lived in rural Germany. And you've got to give people there the chance to do their job as well. And a few other points. Why is there no German YouTube? Why is there no German Facebook? There was. Studio VZ was a major thing back in 2007, 2008. But people opted for things which aren't so data protection friendly because they have a different understanding of it, even though I think data privacy is so important. So do the majority of people really want this data privacy, or do they set other priorities? Another thing, YouTube. You can't use it legally in lots of Germany unless you really look at copyright. And these are also important things. Mr. Schmidt, I found your statement very interesting. Your speech, it was a bit of an understatement, if anything, when you said that the people don't visit websites when they're using mobile applications, but you have the largest market share with Android and so on. So Mr. Gabriel said in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung that you need to think of the possibility to break up Google. You say, of course you don't sell on data, but you are represented in almost all areas of technology. Could you imagine you say, well, we will not share data from one part of our company with another part of a company, in another technology sector. Could you imagine having Chinese walls within the company, not only not passing on to third companies, but also not passing it on within your company? Well, yes, where's the microphone? Daniel Nutgat, healthcare software entrepreneur. Two questions.
In healthcare. And second question, thank you for your kind words about all the talent in Germany. Have you personally invested in Germany? Are you open to doing so? And if yes, can we talk later?
Good.
Nice. There were a lot more questions. Come to the front here. Mr. Schulz in the second row, I think. I've got a microphone already. Come on, I can ask a question. Well, we're talking about yesterday's economy. We're talking about copyright and things. But what about Industry 4.0? Internet of Things, complete changes in healthcare, self-driving cars. What's your view of the infrastructural challenges we're facing in Germany? I would like to hear what our guest has to say about the challenges to infrastructure in Germany, rather than just talking about our concerns. Yes, please. Ingo Schulze, I'm a writer. Thank you for your presentation, because it was a unique experience. I'd never had that before, that somebody doesn't say how good they are, but they say how small and insignificant they allegedly are. So I've never heard that before from a politician or a businessman, I must say. That is quite unique, and that makes me rather skeptical. Now, if I imagine 20 years ago, somebody had described to me, or tried to describe, what Google would be today, I would have thought that it has to be something built up by a community of nations or by the United Nations, or I couldn't have imagined that it could have been done on a private sector basis. And I noticed all the questions to you are ultimately requests. Couldn't you, mightn't you do this, wouldn't you do this, please do whatever. My question is, will in future such an important instrument like the instruments your company have, will we be able to afford that having coming from the private sector in future? Thank you very much. Let's stop there. Mr. Gabriel? Aren't we going over the top with data protection? Somebody asked just now. People say, I don't care. I don't care what happens with my data, they say. But then, when he wants to apply for a training place in a company, he might regret the fact he didn't care about it. And the question of whether you adhere to rules or not, you can't only look at that in terms of whether somebody thinks the rules are superfluous or not. Is that an argument? It means that they are superfluous for the whole society. It wasn't in the past. I think in the past there were people who didn't care whether the intelligence services listened to them or not. That's always been the classic argument, by the way, as if you haven't done anything bad, you shouldn't care what the Secret Service knows about you. That was the Stasi argument in Eastern Germany. And so I don't like that argument. Perhaps they don't care about data privacy. Forget it. Who cares about it? Well, I would say perhaps it's not that simple as to whether the existing instruments are the right ones, as another question. And then I thought one of the last comments was nice. Somebody who said, they talked about yesterday's economy. Where was he? Who said that? There he is. Now, if we'd listened to you 15 years ago, I've said that 15 years ago I had heard the same thing. We're all going bankrupt because the idea that there's a yesterday's economy and one that's disruptively different from that of tomorrow, I don't think that exists. I think it's always a question, and that's the point in the Industry 5.0, to integrate a new technological capability with industrial production. And the decisive question is not whether you need to worry about it, but who's driving the innovation in the car industry? Just imagine, we weren't driving the innovation anymore, then we can forget all the questions about investing in startups and research and science if this company has such dramatic economic upheaval that we lose the car industry, that we're glad that we just roughly keep up our welfare system. I would always be very careful at pretending as though there's something old which we don't have to care about anymore, and there's something brand new which we really need to get onto. But the final question you asked, is the infrastructure we have today as important as we think it is, or shouldn't we be looking at very different infrastructure? Broadband is just one example, which we need for this networking of the new and old economy. Much more important than the question of whether we need to repair the next Autobahn bridge. There you're quite right. There's a complete misrepresentation of the infrastructure we need. People underestimate it. We need more than data highways. We need the question of what will our schools, universities look like? Does it make sense to keep on having Greek and Latin as a second foreign language and to train teachers for that? Oh, I shouldn't. Oh, no, the Greek and Latin teachers don't like me, I'm afraid. But shouldn't they learn programming language and understand what an algorithm is? So, do we have the right educational infrastructure? And do we have the right infrastructure for this new age? I don't think we've answered that yet. You're quite right. And I assume that Mr. Schmidt can tell us an awful lot about that. But we still don't know who will pay for it at the end of the day. That's why we still need the car industry. Okay, is that okay? Do we agree? Yeah, good. Mr. Schmidt, there were questions to you as well.
So, again, I'll try to answer the questions as directly as I can. The first question was about YouTube and Android and data protection. And as far as I know, we are compliant with the data protection rules, with the DPAs and so forth. And the question you asked was, does it make sense to set up Chinese walls within the company? And we don't think so. And the reason we don't think so is that if we were to do so, there are certain kinds of things that we could do for a user that would become impossible. And our goal is to make the user happy, right? And we can, again, as I mentioned, test that. There's a question about healthcare. Google has set up a small healthcare operation inside of Google X. And we've experimented with other things, but this one looks like it's going to be a big success. And the first thing that we did is we built a new kind of contact lens. And this contact lens has the world's smallest computer in it. It's inside the contact lens, and it has the world's smallest battery. And this contact lens changes color based on your insulin state if you're diabetic. And with the explosion of type 1 and type 2 diabetes around the world, this will affect, literally hundreds of millions of people. We license it to a large manufacturer. We're now beginning to do other kinds of healthcare work, but it's all intended to do new solutions to old problems, which we're very proud of. We've also set up a very large investment fund called Calico, which is working on the science of aging. And we hope that that research will ultimately result in discoveries that other companies, obviously German ones as well, will benefit from that research in new drugs and new discoveries to keep us all alive a much longer time. My own investment operation is just beginning in Germany, but I can tell you that Google is already investing in Germany, so let's start right there with Google Ventures. There was a question about what does the infrastructure look like going forward, and a simple rule is that the world's back-end servers will be on cloud computing servers, which are in big data centers. There should be large big data centers in Germany, by the way, run by companies that do that. They will then use fiber, and that fiber will get to homes and businesses, and then they'll use 4G networks. As I tried to say as politely at the beginning of my speech, Germany is not a leader in this area. The minister has clearly identified this as a top priority, and I understand that there's discussions about trying to increase that spending that benefits all Germans and all the companies, and especially German startups. Another question had to do with sort of what's it going to take, and I think you need to do two things that are serious. The first is this infrastructure discussion, and the second one, Mr. Vice Chancellor, is this emphasis on education. Making sure that we're educating people who have the technical skills for the next set of labor force. Germany has been a leader in this in many ways with the technical training programs that you all have had for many years. You're the envy of America in this. There's a new field, for example, called data analytics, which is exactly what you're describing, which is the ability to understand how data is used and misused, how to program it, how to do algorithms in a simple way. Those standards are now beginning to be possible. And I think the final question was, is this area so important that we leave this up to private companies? And the benefit of private companies, and I'm obviously a capitalist here, is that they tend to move much faster. And we all understand that there are needs to regulate, as the Vice Chancellor said, but we have all benefited from the fact that the internet is largely a private sector capitalistic operation. So for example, the internet itself is owned by telecommunications companies and not by the government, but the government provides significant financial incentives. The government provided much of the research and research funding that went to the creation of the internet and many of the things that we're doing now. So I'm a strong believer in a public-private partnership where the government focuses on research and getting out of the way, allowing these things to be created, and then whole new industries can be built here in Germany.
Well,
we're looking at the clock. I think, I'm afraid, we're now going to have to end this question round, but I think it was really very interesting. We're most grateful to you, Mr. Schmidt, for agreeing to join in the discussion, and for you, Mr. Gabriel, for launching this discussion. And I think we've been good to continue it, because I think there are still a lot of questions which remain unanswered. Thank you very much to both of you. Thank you.